Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some tips and tricks that I've used to conduct research using the SSU library resources. These are tips that can also help you develop sources for the rhetorical analysis. The sources you read will need to help you get a sense of how Ida B. Wells, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King were persuasive to their particular audiences, the audiences that they were addressing in their speeches. That means that you need to be able to understand the historical context in which the speeches were given. And so, because history matters quite a bit in this assignment, we're going to focus on tips that will help you collect that kind of information for the rhetorical analysis. So a few words about the role of research in this assignment and how you're going to use research in the rhetorical analysis. The research that you use and that you collect needs to help you support your argument, needs to help you support your analysis of the speeches. It's not information that you're going to cite in the introduction and then forget for the rest of the essay. It needs to help you out in the body paragraphs as you're making your argument about the speech. It needs to support the claims that you make, again, in the body paragraphs. Therefore, you're going to need to learn quite a bit about the speech and the person that delivered the speech. You'll need to learn about the situation in which he or she wrote that text. You're going to need to learn about the attitudes that people had at that time towards the author and towards the issues that the author was writing about. You're going to need to develop quite an understanding of the speech and the history that surrounded the speech. And that could be difficult to do, but let me show you a few different ways that you might go about doing that. And we're going to start first with what I think you're probably most familiar with, and that's using Google. But what I'd like to do is to show you a trick that can make Google work a little bit smarter for you and can link up Google with the SSU library. And if this is something you already know about, you can skip ahead for a couple minutes. But here we go. So we're going to talk about Google Scholar. And to find Google Scholar, you can just, in a Google search, just search for Google Scholar. You can also type in scholar.google.com and it should bring this screen up right here. So I'm currently on an SSU network right now, so some of this stuff is auto-populated. But to get Google kind of linked up to your Google profile, you click that menu up here, go to Settings, and in Library Links, that's where you want to go next. So in Library Links, and mine is already kind of auto-populated in there, you want to search for Shawnee State University Library, and then click it and then save. So find the Shawnee State University Library full text and save it. Okay, so now we go back over to our search bar, and now when we search Google Scholar, it is returning results that are also in the Shawnee State University Library, and then we have access to full text. And it's really super helpful to do this because Google Scholar, the search mechanisms there, you're probably a little bit more familiar with. Although I do think it's important that you learn how to use the Clark Memorial Library, learn how to use their search fields. So let's try a couple searches in Google Scholar. So let's learn a little bit about letter from Birmingham Jail. So let's see what they have. So letter from Birmingham Jail, these are our results, and you can see which ones are coming from the SSU library because they're over here, full text of SSU library, and we also have the PDF, a direct link to the PDF there. So you kind of see some of the sources that you can use. Some of them are just the full text of the letter itself, and then there are others that are like commentary, and it's those commentary ones that are actually going to be really kind of useful for this upcoming assignment. So I'm looking at this assignment, or this text right here, instrumental and constitutive rhetoric in Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail. I think that might be a good one to follow up on if that's a speech that you want to kind of take a look at. So Google Scholar is one kind of useful way to use a search engine that you're probably really familiar with. You can also, it's less relevant for this assignment, but you can kind of customize the date range, patents. You can kind of unclick that to kind of reduce the number of returns that you get. So you can play around a little bit with the search results. You can do a lot more of this in the Clark Memorial Library database that we're going to talk about next. So hold on, let me change screens. All right, so now we're at the Clark Memorial Library website, and we want to find databases that are going to help us out with this upcoming assignment. Your first inclination might be to use this big search field, the discovery service. It's really tempting. It's the shotgun approach to research, though. What it does is it just kind of like goes through all of our databases, through all of our materials that we have at Shawnee State University. It just kind of rifles through them, and it returns results for any words that you put in there. And so again, like, it's kind of that shotgun approach. It's not going to kind of narrow your focus. Discovery Surface is great to start with, but once you start developing a few key terms that you can use, you really kind of need to get into research databases to make that kind of worth your while, to make sure that you're not kind of going through a ton of research results. So I go to A to Z list of research databases. So here's our databases. There's an A to Z list here, and you kind of need to know, you have to play with it maybe just a little while. You could kind of like do all subjects. You can do that kind of search here, and I think history. Oops. So let's do H for history, historical abstracts, historical statistics of the United States, history and archives. So these might be relevant to the work that you guys are doing. So in historical abstracts, we might choose Ida B. Wells Barnett. And that's our Ida Wells. And so various beautiful and terrible, the life and legacy of Ida B. Wells Barnett. So that might be a decent source. So you've got to find full text, and they can kind of track down that full text article for you. So let's say that you get a ton of results, and you kind of want to limit it. So I don't know, you want to do history in there, or lynch laws and all its phases. That's the name of the speech that you wrote. Lynch laws and all its phases, and it might kind of narrowed it too much. But maybe if we did lynching. And there we go. We have 9 results. So it really kind of focuses your research. You use Discovery Service, you use Google, you're going to get a ton of responses, but they might be shit responses. You want to get something that is a little bit more focused. It gives you something that could be really kind of useful, or much more useful. There's a really good chance that one of these, or a few of these 9 sources, would be helpful. So like Google Scholar, you have options here on the side that help you kind of limit things a little bit. If you want to use scholarly sources, I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Academic journals, you want to limit the time range. There's ways to kind of do that over here. So here's our research databases. I'm going to show you one more database before I get out of the Clark Memorial Library. So 1 second, I'm going to go back to the main screen. There's one other database I wanted to show you. So we're back at the main screen for the Clark Memorial Library. Again, A to Z list of research databases. And I want to go to M for newspapers. And there's an interesting source in here that I think could be relevant to the work that you guys are doing. So Newsbank, Ohio's historical newspapers from 1809 to 1922. That's going to be relevant. That might be relevant for Ida B. Wells and her speech. Newspaper source, that's the one that I'm kind of thinking of. That if you want to kind of know what was happening, like what were people saying in newspapers, in the editorial pages or in the opinion pages back in the 1960s when Malcolm X gave his speech, or when Martin Luther King gave his speech, this might be a source that you can kind of take a look at. So different options for where to get your information from for the rhetorical analysis. Another great source that you can use for the rhetorical analysis is opinion polling. They conducted polls in the 1960s about Malcolm X, about Martin Luther King. They asked folks across the country about race relations, and I think that could provide you a really interesting background into what were people thinking about race at the time. I think it's going to be very different than what you think it was. So before I go, I need to address an important issue related to the upcoming rhetorical analysis, and that's the kind of sources that you should be using. Now, you can use academic sources, but you should be using at least credible sources, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two. So academic sources are those that are written by experts for other experts. These are people that study a topic for a living. It's part of their job. They research a particular area. and they're producing research for other scholars that are researching the same thing. They typically get published in journals and in books that are made just for other scholars. I study writing assessment, and I write articles and I publish for other people that study the same thing to read. That's academic research, or what we would call expert sources. You can use those sources for the rhetorical analysis, but you don't necessarily have to. Credible sources can be pieces by journalists or reporters or publications that we trust, typically journalism and news media. So the blog post by some rando dude who got really pissed about Malcolm X or who really loves Malcolm X, that's not going to cut it for this assignment. An article that's on the New York Times or in the Atlantic or Newsweek or Time or an opinion poll about people's attitudes towards Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, those are great sources. Those work. You can also use popular books and sources that address the historical time period of the speech. I'm thinking about more popular books by historians like Doris Kearns Goodwin or Ron Chernow. You could also choose more popular books by folks that are not historians, but who do write about race relations, like Michelle Alexander or Ta-Nehisi Coates. Those kinds of history books, popular history books, those would definitely be appropriate for the rhetorical analysis. Sources that will not work for this assignment are sources by folks that are just trying to get some clicks. Blog entries aren't going to work, like I mentioned. A short article on the History Channel, that's not going to work all that well either. You're going from a basic understanding of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, and you're just kind of getting introduced to Ida B. Wells. And you need to go from that basic understanding of those people to getting an understanding of what was going on at that time. It's a very different thing. So if you're struggling with this, let me know. I'm going to ask you to do some research over the next couple weeks, and you'll need to find your own sources for this upcoming assignment. We should, however, share what we learn. And so we're going to have opportunities to kind of share the different resources that we find so that we can learn from each other about these important speeches. So you're going to try this out a little bit for today's discussion board. You might get frustrated and it might not work the way that you want to, but don't get discouraged and don't give up if you can't find sources. Let me know how it goes, and I'll give you some feedback on your research process and let you know whether or not the source that you found for today is one that you could use for the rhetorical analysis. Now, that's it for now. I'll see you all soon on the discussion board.